Hello and welcome to the Queer Thesperience. I am your host, Casper Oliver. My pronouns are he, him. I am a bisexual trans man, and I am a performer in many ways: immersion theater, voice, film, stage. If I can get my grubby hands on it, I will be there. And today I have an awesome guest. I will allow you to introduce yourself.
Hi, everybody. My name is Adam O'Connell. My pronouns are he, him, his. I am a queer trans man, and I'm an actor and a writer, and I am the current writer and host of the Great American Scream, a horror culture and comedy podcast.
Which I'm so excited to get you on here because my ties with horror. I actually have a very deep history with horror, which is weird because when it comes to watching horror, I am a weenie. I am a massive wuss, but I've been in horror films. I've performed in haunted houses. I was convention staff for Horror Hound up in the Midwest for like 8 years. So I've done all this stuff, but watching horror is I love the community behind it. So when you reached out and were like, hey, I have a podcast, we talk about horror, let's talk about horror, I was like, yes, let's do this thing. So tell us a bit about your podcast.
Yeah, so I have always been a really big horror fan. As a kid, I was kind of like a Wednesday Addams kind of child. I was really into stuff like Courage the Cowardly Dog and the Addams Family. Like anything that was macabre or just spooky in any way is really what I was like attracted to. And I think part of that because I didn't really like come to terms with like my queer and trans identity until halfway through high school. But I think there was a part of me that was always attracted to the inherent like campiness that spans across all aspects of horror. And when I was a senior in high school, I was in this was after I had started transitioning and came out. I was in a class where we did like essay college like writing practice, and I wrote two big like 13-page essays that year. One that was about trans and queer representation in television and film, and then another one that was about horror and how like the genre has morphed as time has changed and what Americans are afraid of and how it affects what horror movies are. And then I'd like after I'd finished these two essays, I was like, I can talk about both of these things at the same time. I have the technology. And so I got really into researching queer representation in horror, queerness in horror, queer horror makers, and sort of how the community interacts with the genre. Because like I feel like a lot of big, the horror genre kind of has two really big fan bases. One is kind of like older like cis straight men, and then the other is like queer people. Yeah, so it's interesting. I mean, both I think attracted to different things about the genre, but both still big fans of the genre. So I've done a lot of research on queerness and how it presents itself in the genre, and I wanted kind of a medium not only to talk about that, but just things about the genre and the subcultures of the genre in general. And one of my dear friends, who's also a podcaster, was a complete newbie to the horror genre. So I was like, you're perfect. I'm going to take you and kind of, it's like a walkthrough guide of different horror subcultures and subgenres. So we talk about different tropes in horror film. We talk about haunted attractions. We talk about creepypasta. We talk about ritual games like Bloody Mary. Like, but it's all like, it's not a scary show. We have fun. We goof around. Right. It's just kind of an exploration of the different parts of the genre.
Yeah, and I think that's really cool. I recently found you on Spotify, and my phone would cooperate, I was going to listen to a few episodes before we recorded, but then life got away from me. But I am very excited to like start delving into it and listening to it. I find myself very attracted towards things like true crime podcasts, which, depending on the type of true crime, can definitely fit in horror. Yes. Depending on how macabre they go. And I've noticed a trend where a lot of the most, at least in my book, the horror I've been most able to digest, I don't know if this is, I don't know what the connection is, but the connection between either indie or queer creators and horror.
Yeah.
And it might be just how certain tropes are handled by queer creators. So I wanted to kind of delve in a bit on your research with queer representation and also queer creators in horror. So that's this is
Yeah.
kind of new for me, but you have a lot of experience in this.
Yeah, totally. I think queer people have always kind of been able to see themselves in horror in one way or another. I think primarily early on, like queer people have always seen themselves coded as villains in some variety,
Yep.
especially if you grew up on like Disney movies. It's very easy as like a young queer person to see yourself in these campy villains because they were written to be that way. They were written to be a certain way, in that like queerness is viewed as sinister and threatening. Therefore, we see ourselves in these villains. But then I think since queer people have kind of claimed those villains kind of as their own because they identify with them so much. And we talked about this briefly on the show, like unrelated to whatever we were talking about, but how in the most recent like live action remakes of Disney movies, they've kind of tried to unqueer code the villains, because probably in their heads going, oh God, like this was wrong, we shouldn't have done this. But it makes them so much more boring.
Yep.
Like it's watching the live action Lion King and Aladdin, like when you take this like campiness and inherent fun that the queer people have claimed from the coding, like they're like, they're ours now.
Yep.
We don't want you to change them. But then I think because it's so kind of easy to see ourselves in these villains, a lot of those common tropes of what we would see in a queer-coded villain in a children's movie shows up in horror, because as a kid, we're kind of taught what to be afraid of, and then as an adult, it's expanded upon in this genre. But unfortunately, that then manifests in a genre that's taken a lot more seriously, and unfortunately manifests itself in a lot of problematic tropes. We just did a big special on queer tropes in horror films on our show, and one of them that we talked about that I think is most prevalent in the horror genre is this like cross-dresser as villain kind of trope. And everybody's seen it before. If you've seen Psycho, if you've seen Silence of the Lambs, it's extremely prevalent, the idea that cross-dressing is inherently creepy, or dressing in clothes of another gender is inherently scary or threatening, because we've learned to associate them with villains like Norman Bates and Buffalo Bill. And we talked interestingly about how these movies try and sometimes skirt around it by they have lines in the movies that are like, there's one in Silence of the Lambs where it's like, oh, he's not a transsexual, using language from the film, he's not a transsexual, he just thinks he is. Which, so they're trying to say like, oh, like we're not actually making a comment on trans people because blah, 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 blah. But that now it's so hardwired in our brains to associate it with being creepy or being scary that it's become, it shows up in other genres too.
Right.
Like if you've ever seen The Dark Knight, the scene where the Joker is like at the hospital and he's dressing as a nurse to disguise himself, like that's not supposed to be a scary moment. If anything, it's treated as slightly comical. But of course, he's not masquerading as a male nurse or a male doctor to come to this hospital. They automatically put him in like, quote, women's clothing, because they know the audience will associate it with creepiness. And that is extremely prevalent in horror. And it's kind of turned from the Norman Bates style of, oh, it's a symptom of his delusions of being so obsessed with his mother, is that now, since we associate it so strongly, a lot of horror creators and directors and writers will just put characters in a moment in the film where they're wearing a dress or wearing a wig just to be creepy. Like it's not supposed to be part of their backstory or whatever. It's just like, oh, wouldn't this be creepy if he was wearing a dress in the scene or whatever? And it's become so incredibly hardwired in our brains. It's a hard trope to shake, especially because now it's permeated so many other genres, and it's almost entirely with villains when this is the case, and when it's a hero, it's treated as comedy and really doesn't show up in the genre. But that it's kind of always in the back of my mind now when I watch these films and things that are great movies like Silence of the Lambs and Psycho.
Yeah.
But to think about how this trope has kind of hardwired and affected us culturally, that now we associate it with this creepy thing. I mean, you wonder why people automatically associate trans women with being predatory, and like this kind of media tropes is why.
Yeah.
But you might not think of that actively because you see it so much. And another one that we talked about briefly is like, as queer person as villain, but also queer person as victim, that we are starting to see more trans representation and queer representation in horror film, but a lot of the time, unfortunately, that character doesn't make it to the end of the movie.
Yeah.
And it's nowadays, I don't think it's as often treated as maliciously. Like, I don't think writers and directors are killing queer characters on screen maliciously. We're obviously meant to sympathize with them and feel bad and recognize like, oh, that's wrong that that person is dying. But they still like don't make it to the end of the movie, and their deaths are treated for shock value or to advance the story of the main character. I don't know if you saw the most recent It movie, the sequel. It opened with a scene of this queer couple who are attacked and then killed by being thrown in the river. And it's supposed to show how Pennywise the clown is like affecting the town and making it more hateful and stuff like that. And it's from the book, but the scene is so jarring and like I've sat through a lot of really, really gory horror movies, and it was the hardest thing I've ever had to watch in a horror film. And is it showing how Pennywise is making the town scarier, more hateful, and people apathetic? Absolutely it is. But then it comes with this shock value of it being like a literal hate crime.
And it's so real for people like us to sit and watch.
Yeah, exactly. And to say that like, oh, this could only happen in a town that's being invaded by this evil clown is entirely untrue and like a little insulting. But I don't think a lot of audiences, especially when they watch horror films, really have that. They don't take it, because people don't take the horror genre seriously. So they don't think of it like they think of a drama film or a TV show or something like that. When a lot of the times when people, especially who aren't like horror fans, go to see a horror movie, they're just in it for the scare. They're in it for the monster and stuff. So it's not something I think people actively think about. But now, because horror is so often also controlled by independent creators, it allows for the space for queer creators and independent creators to kind of to create their own works in a way, but often are not as widely marketed or distributed and stuff. So but I think regardless, like I said, with how the queer kind of subculture of the horror fans, we're just attracted to that inherent camp that is so permeated in regular queer culture and other queer media, that horror movies are campy. They're ridiculous. They're fun. They're silly. Like, these monsters are over the top and crazy. That's what makes a good movie. And it's campy. And I think that's why so many queer people are attracted to it. It's fashionable. It's like, there's so much about it that it's a big show. Like, any good camp should be. And like, it's kind of this dichotomy of like treating horror seriously, but also treating it as camp. And I take my camp very seriously. So I think, I think that's part of why it's so attractive to queer people.
Yeah. And there's also something that might be slightly odd, but both my mom and my dad is a huge horror film buff, and my mom was also a huge horror film buff. And my mom and I would sit, and she introduced me to horror. And my mom showed me, when I was probably too young, one of the newer Dawn of the Dead movies, the Resident Evil movies. And it was Mia Jovovich as Alice in Resident Evil 2 that made young little me go, I like girls. It's a sort of thing where, and then my mom, after I came out as bi, my mom came out as bi. So we would just sit and watch horror films and go, oh, they're cute no matter. Because another aspect of horror is there's a lot of that physical appeal of the heroes, whether it's male, female, whatever. It's like, it's sexy to be strong, and also strong is a thing. Like the movie, I don't know if you've ever seen the movie Pulse. It was those ghosts would go through the Wi-Fi.
Right.
And there were a few scenes where, yeah, they were sexualizing the female lead, but I think a lot of her most attractive scenes, quote unquote, were just her in a t-shirt and jeans kicking ass, you know?
Oh, yeah.
And it's just because you see these kinds of characters surviving. And I do kind of want to trail back a bit with the cross-dressing. Is, you know, as two trans people, we see this. I remember the first time I ever saw that in something outside of like Silence of the Lambs, and I don't know how you want to categorize Rocky Horror Picture Show. That entire thing is just, that is its own
topic. Yeah,
that's its own episode. But was in an episode of Criminal Minds where the actor, I think Jackson Rathbone, played a serial killer, and it was after he got super popular in Twilight as Jasper. But he played not only a serial killer, but he played a serial killer with multiple personalities, and the other personality was a woman. And so it kind of went. The problem was they still made the character very sympathetic, but it still doesn't really fix the fact that you are demonizing both multiple personality, like, you know, dissociative identity disorder and transgender women, because they did have this huge bonding moment between the killer and Spencer Reed, the character played by Matthew Gray Gubler, and it still didn't sit right with me, because it's like, okay, sympathetic, but you're ending it showing them in jail after they've murdered all these people. And it's a horror, and it doesn't really feel like, as exactly as you said, it doesn't feel like it's being intentionally malicious. Because they try and make them sympathetic. But that doesn't reverse the damage that is being done with the stereotypes.
Yeah. And I think that, like, since the genre has been around for so long, these tropes have been around for so long, a lot of the times you kind of have to step back and to recognize exactly what's going on. Like, I don't think a lot of people end up realizing, I go to a lot of haunted attractions, haunted houses, and a common thing I see at almost every attraction I go to is some take on, like, the insane asylum, the mental asylum. And when you step back, you go, oh, that's like not a great trope to be perpetuating right now, but it's so permeated that you don't even think, when you see like a haunted attraction or movie that involves an insane asylum, you go, oh, that's a horror thing, like it's an insane asylum. But because you just see it so much, and stepping back, you really kind of have to remove yourself from it and look at it within the lens of the whole culture to recognize like where tropes like that come from. There's also this insane Brian De Palma movie called Dressed to Kill, starring Michael Caine, where he played, what you said about Criminal Minds reminded me of it, because he plays a serial killer who, and like using the language of the film, is like wants to be a woman, but every time he dresses up as a woman, he's still attracted to women. So his quote male side makes him kill because he like can't be a woman and also be attracted to women. And like he's got the male side quote and the female side that are like fighting each other, and that's when he kills people. It's insanity. It's a crazy movie. But I think that's kind of like the culmination of what all of these harmful tropes lead to, is this idea that people have about trans people. And people wonder of like why being trans was classified as an illness until quite literally last year.
Yeah.
It's because we've kind of been brought up to believe that having a desire to transition or wanting to express your gender in a way that isn't expected, society doesn't expect you to do so, means there is something wrong with you and something that is potentially harmful or potentially dangerous. And we've kind of been brought up on these tropes, and it's hard to unlearn, but it can be done.
Oh, yeah. And I think a great first step, and I've been seeing this in my social circles and also in film festivals, is more queer creators making queer content. Because I remember at one point I had been sent this like vampire film, and the person who sent it to me was like, "Oh, it's got lesbian vampires, you should watch it." And I'm like, it was being sent to me by a straight person. And so
Yeah.
my first thought was, okay, you assume because it has lesbians in it that me as a queer person want to see it. But then secondly, I'm like, of course I want to see it. It has,
how dare you, but I'm still gonna watch it.
Yeah. And then I watched it, and it was this very violent, fetishized view, like the almost like it was more like watching a horror themed adult film,
Right.
than a horror film. And that's just this unfortunate trope with like women who are attracted to women. It just gets inherently sexualized. And it doesn't help that it was vampires, because that is also just a vampire thing.
Yeah.
But usually when it's queer creators, it feels more like a movie than a queer spectacle.
Yeah.
Which
Oh no, I'm sorry. I was saying there's a thing that a friend of mine said to me when we were talking about queer villains, especially in the horror or like crime genre, because we were talking about that show, The Assassination of Gianni Versace, which is based on a true story, so it doesn't always kind of like fit like the idea of like queer rap and tropes and stuff.
Right.
But I was like, that show, the character, the killer, is a queer man, but played by Darren Criss. And I was like, there's something about the way they wrote that character that felt like right. Like it didn't feel like this like queer equals crazy equals killer thing. Like something felt really good about it, but I couldn't put my finger on it. And she said, because there were so many other queer characters in that show, him being the killer was treated as like the outlier and not the norm.
Right.
And I don't think people realize that by simply putting more queer characters into a film, then the killer, the crazy person, becomes the exception. And if you show queer characters, even in the horror genre, who are loving, kind, or simply not murderous people, then it rounds out the film and the story as far as queer representation goes, and it humanizes everyone in the film.
And that's a thing. This doesn't pertain strictly to horror. This is just a general thing. But one thing that gets under my skin when it comes to representation is, like, for example, they have one queer character, and they're like, "Oh, look, the queer," and then like us within the LGBT community are like, "There's only one." I mean,
statistically,
no, there's 4 of us in this household. All 4 of us are queer. Like,
there's gotta be someone else.
We flock together like penguins searching for warmth in this cis normative world. Like, there is not going to be just one of us.
There has to be another one.
Yeah, and so I had a talk just the other day. Like, wouldn't it just be nice to have one of those movies, those old iconic slasher films, right? A bunch of teenagers are off on a road trip, car breaks down, slasher shows up. But just, it's a road trip of all the queer band kids decided to go off, and it's just a road trip of queer kids. Like, that's it. And you could have a very, very similar film, but just and it would be realistic if you ask a single queer person.
Like, interestingly, there is a movie that is like that. It is oh my god, I want to make sure I get the title right. But so it's a slasher movie, I believe, from the early 2000s. about a slasher that I haven't seen this movie, but I should. It's called Hellbent. It's from 2004. It is about a slasher, a serial killer that is targeting like the queer, like, and not targeting as in like we also see like the straight community, but his like victim base is based in this like queer community of this one city and this like one gay club. And it's kind of like a Scream style whodunit if you're trying to figure out which one of these like gay men is also the killer. It's not a great movie from what I've heard, but it is kind of like a step in the right, like as far as the film goes, but it's like a step kind of in the right direction of when you show all these queer characters together, it gets rid of the trope because you're showing this serial killer alongside this like well-adjusted like queer hero.
Right. And
I should watch this movie, but I haven't seen it.
That's probably also going to have to go on my list as well because, well, but yeah, and I think what's really nice to see, especially in the indie horror film scene, is just how many queer creators are able to make and share their work. And I feel from what I've heard, it's kind of easier to get your queer-based horror film into a film festival than like a queer romance or a queer like sci-fi, because usually in those not so much sci-fi is also a whole other animal, but because with horror there isn't as often this focus on romance. So if there are queer characters, it's not as centered on the romance between the queer characters,
right?
As it is the survival of just the characters. And I just kind of wanted to ask your view on queer creators making queer content versus just the overall industry.
Yeah. So like you said, that the horror genre is not one that often focuses on romantic relationships of any kind. Like horror movies have a lot of sex, but very often we're not following it like for the romantic relationships between the characters. And therefore, when queer characters do exist in horror movies and are not killers, they're kind of like incidentally queer in a way. I've seen it in a couple of movies. I think Truth or Dare, which was not a good movie, but they had a queer character in it who has this like, it's a Blumhouse movie where they have to like do scary truth or dares or bad stuff happens. And then one of his dares is to like come out to his dad, which could have been a great scene, but he goes like, "Dad, I have something to tell you." And then the scene cuts and we don't actually get to see him come out, which is infuriating. But I think a lot of horror movies end up with that, where we learn about a character's queerness through like one-off lines and stuff like that. And I think that often comes from well-intentioned straight directors and writers who want to include queer characters but aren't sure how to do it. Because I feel like a lot of straight creators kind of get in the conundrum of, I want to put in queer rep, but I don't want to stereotype, and I don't want to make it the only thing they talk about or whatever. So they like get all in their heads and end up like kind of accidentally revealing that these characters are queer. And I wish there was something that I could, like a word for this, but when it's a queer creator writing a queer character, there's just like something about like the flavor of that character,
right? Where
you can just like it feels like close to heart and it feels familiar. Like you can feel it, like the wavelength of like, you can feel that this character is queer or this is a queer story. And I think that's separate from like queer coding, in that in queer coding it kind of feels like a slide secret that they kind of put under it, and then with this it just feels like familial,
right?
And even if the characters don't explicitly talk about it or we don't see a queer relationship on screen, there's something about it that just feels like, I don't want to say like a gaydar because whatever, but there's just but that's what it like does. I always tell people that there's a difference between straight gaydar and gay gaydar. Like straight gaydar is when people are like, I think I can tell people are queer because of how they dress or how they talk or whatever, and then queer gaydar is just, you get like the vibes and you can you just feel it. And I think people will get that from, at least I get that from consuming a queer created content. And then in the fact that whether or not a queer creator can make a horror movie that doesn't have anything to do with queerness or doesn't have any queer characters, but the idea of just being able to support a queer creator by watching their film or buying the movie or whatever is a great way to expose yourself to queer created work. Because if you find a director or a film that you like, the chances are that director has worked on a lot of other stuff that you'll probably also enjoy, and maybe one of those things talks about a queer issue. But I think that kind of taking that extra step to support queer creators, regardless of what the content of the movie is, as long as you enjoy it, it's a great step.
Yeah.
And will probably likely lead you to better representation than you're going to find in a kind of more mainstream horror film. But because the indie horror genre is so vast and wide, you'll have to do a little bit of digging. But Shudder is actually right now working on a documentary about the history of queerness in horror. They just did one based off of the horror noir book where they talked about blackness in horror and how horror has interacted with the Black community. And they're doing one with the queer community now, directed by Sam Weinman, and I'm really excited for it because it's going to cover both kind of like how it's shown up in the past in a problematic way and kind of what people are working on now, and where in horror queer people have also seen themselves in kind of like unexpected places.
Yeah. And I'm definitely gonna have to keep my eye out for that, because I'm also just a huge sucker for documentaries.
Oh, so... yeah. I love big old anthology. Just give me all the information.
But no, I think I like what you said about when a queer when a queer creator like makes queer characters and you can just feel it.
Yeah.
And that especially helps when you have queer actors, queer performers playing them, because the little intricacies that would have tipped you off when meeting this kind of person in person are then in the character. And it's the little things that we see in ourselves or notice in ourselves, and we see them in this character and go, same hat? Like, are we?
Yeah.
You know, and you get that sense of camaraderie that when you meet strangers. Like, I met a friend who, they worked at Hot Topic, and we started talking, and we both triggered each other's queerdar and transdar. And so I kind of just went on a limb. I was like, yeah, you're on Facebook, and we now chat. And you can get that similar vibe of wanting to know the person, that camaraderie through the screen.
Oh, yeah.
Through your headphones, if it's like an audio drama. And this isn't exactly horror, but it does have a dark humor vibe to it, and it definitely could fit in the horror genre. But Welcome to Night Vale, the very Twin Peaks love. I actually have a tattoo of it.
Oh my god!
And first tattoo I ever got. But just the nuances with the characters and the symbolism they use with different characters to more putting like trans characters, but they aren't trans, but they're using that bizarre world's reality to be like, this is basically trans, but it's like different because of the weird magics that happen in Welcome to Night Vale. And also just the peak beauty that is the canonical couple of Cecil and Carlos.
It's so beautiful.
Just, it's mwah, mwah. And all of so many queer performers are in that show. Like, for example, Kevin, when you first meet Kevin, there is no indication that he is gay until much later, right? But with the actor, you hear him, and I'm like, oh, that boy, he gay. Like, you just and again, like, that's not even touched on and with him being a villain, it doesn't stick out because you have Cecil and Carlos and Earl and so many other queer characters all throughout the series, that the villains being queer is like, oh, there's more of you. Like,
yeah, exactly. It becomes the exception to like what we believe the queer community to be in this certain piece of media. And I think queer people also often, like, when we're seeking out movies or books or TV shows or podcasts or whatever, we often seek escapism and other worlds just because like we live in a shitty world for queer people. So to have media that is set in some place like Night Vale or somewhere far removed, where queerness still exists is exciting and fun. And I'm a big fan of any kind of escapist media, both for just my own brain, but also just as a piece of art in general. Because I've like, in college, I worked with a lot of artists who wanted their art to be very much grounded in the real world. And that totally works for them and their writing style and what they want to make. But that doesn't really jive with me. I like making fantastical worlds and things that are kind of removed where you can literally step into another world or another place and just forget about what's going on outside, or think about what's going on outside but in this different new fun context. And I think stuff like Night Vale and horror in general is a fun way to do that.
So as we start getting kind of close to wrapping up, a question that I ask all of my guests is if you met someone who, or either like maybe your younger self, or you met someone that was kind of in your shoes, traversing into horror and also their own identity, trying to kind of find their place with queer horror, what advice would you give?
I always say that the one thing that I wish I would have told myself when I was younger and first transitioning was kind of like, as an actor and as a creator, to not let yourself get treated as a burden. Because my primary, when I first came out and started transitioning and kept performing, because I performed with the same theater company for a while, my whole big word, my mantra was like, they can cast me however they want me, as long as it's in a male role and as long as I get to keep performing. So I let them say things to me like, oh, we can't cast you in a romantic part because it might make the girls uncomfortable, or oh, I can't give you this because blah, 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 blah. And we're like, oh, we have to put you in a different dressing room. And like, I just like accepted that. Like, I was like, oh, as long as I get to keep doing shows, like this is fine. And then looking back, I'm like, oh my God, like no other person should have to feel that way, because I like, don't ever let yourself get treated as something that a director or whoever's in charge of your artistic space has to like accommodate, or something they have to modify for. Like, you are not a burden in the room. Your artistic input and what you create is a gift that will enrich what you're creating. It will not take away from it. Like, don't ever let yourself get treated as something that the other people have to overcome or excuse. Like, you are there to create and to contribute just as much as everybody else is.
That's beautiful. I love that. and I kind of feel that a little bit. When I first started in Florida on stage, I hadn't come out yet. I was very in the closet. I played very hyper feminine roles. In one show, I played 3 different moms. Like, it was ridiculous. And when I first came out, I was in a very similar of like, because I was about to go back and start performing at the same theater, of like, whatever makes you comfortable. I just don't want to play female roles anymore.
Yeah.
And I ended up getting cast in a very, very, very small role. But it was my first male role, so I was elated. And it wasn't until I looked back that I was like, really? Okay. I have a much longer acting resume and more. Okay, whatever.
The exact same thing happened to me in high school, and I can't believe that I let a director, because I played like a lead the year before, and then for this show, I got cast in the ensemble, and I was like, whatever, like, it's just, I made excuses for myself. I was like, oh, it's like luck of the draw, part's not for me, whatever. But then my director, who was a little gremlin man, so I wasn't surprised that he said this to me, but was talking to me one day. He was like, well, you know, you were supposed to get like the leading lady in the show, but like, quote, then you ruined it. And at the time I was like, oh, okay. But looking back, I'm like, I cannot believe I let a person say that to me.
Yeah.
How terrible. Don't let anybody ever say stuff like that to you.
No, because you don't deserve that. No.
Yeah.
But thank you so very much for being on the podcast today. This has been a lot of fun.
Yeah. Thank you for having me. This was really fun.
Where can our listeners here find you elsewhere?
Yeah, great. So you can check out my podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or whatever feeds you get your podcasts on. It's called The Great American Scream. We post new episodes every Tuesday. It's a kind of a comedy and horror culture podcast. So we talk about mostly fun stuff. We don't really do true crime or stuff like that. So if you're looking just to learn about fun spooky games or spooky movies and stuff, come check it out. And you can also follow us, that podcast, on Twitter at Great Scream Pod, or on Facebook at The Great American Scream. And then you can also follow me on Instagram and Twitter at Adam J. Ocon, O-C-O-N. I'm not really on Twitter as much anymore because it makes my brain hurt, but I'm on Instagram. So come check me out there.
And if you're listening to this on YouTube, I will put links down in the description so you can just scroll down, click them, and find them there. And if you would like to check out more of the Queer Thesperience, we are uploading every Friday with different guests from different parts of the LGBT plus community and different parts of the entertainment world. You can find us on YouTube, Spotify, Podbean, Stitcher, and we're slowly spreading across wherever you find your podcasts. You can also find us on Twitter with just Thesperience, or you can find us on Instagram with The Queer Thesperience. Again, links will be down in the description below. And thank you all so much for listening. And remember, all the world's a stage, so give them one hell of a show. Thank you so much for joining me, Adam. It has been a great time, and thank you for listening. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thanks for having me.